for talking to me, and I appreciate your time. Now, Prime Minister Carney has succeeded where Trudeau couldn't, getting Prime Minister Modi to accept a G7 invitation. What changed here? And what does this tell us about the diplomatic approach, or should we say the diplomatic reset of sorts between the two countries?
Well, first of all, Carney originally is a banker. He understands the importance of India, and he also understands the importance of fact and reality. Justin Trudeau was a politician who peddled in image and imagination. And therefore, it makes sense that Carney wants to restore maturity to the relationship. And look, it actually makes sense for Prime Minister Modi to show that the problem all along was not Canada itself. It was just the immaturity and unprofessionalism of Justin Trudeau.
Right. Now, reports suggest that Canada has placed a law enforcement condition on this invitation. Is this a face-saving diplomacy or genuine progress in the Niger investigation from the Canadian side?
Well, certainly it is a little bit of politics on the part of Carney, but all along, the Indian government has said that they are willing to have a serious dialogue, much like they have had with the United States. The problem with Justin Trudeau is for his own domestic reasons, for his own political reasons, and to assuage radical constituencies. He was basically shooting from the hip without any factual base to support his accusations against India. What Prime Minister Modi is showing is that India has nothing to hide. But here's the thing. If you're going to have a serious law enforcement dialogue, it's got to be two ways. We've got to talk about illegal immigration into Canada. We've got to talk about terror finance in Canada. We've got to talk about the radical Sikh mafias and how the Kalistan movement is tied to organized crime and terrorism. So by all means, Canada should have a dialogue about law enforcement with India. But it's essential that Canada recognize that it is not going to set the full parameters of this. India has a lot to say, and for justice to be served, Canada has to stop acting like the condescending white man dictating to India in the 19th century. That was Justin Trudeau's style. Mark Carney has to approach India perhaps as equals, and perhaps even more as supplicants, given the difference in the economies.
Right. Now, in the real world, economic realities often drive diplomatic solutions. With India being the world's fourth largest economy, was Canada simply unable to afford a continued isolation towards India?
I think there's a lot to that. I mean, India at this point may even be the world's third largest economy. The fact of the matter is, Canada has long sought to rest on its laurels, but ultimately its foundations were not solid. They were riddled with termites. And what we are seeing now is a recognition by Canada that it needs to deal with India as a true partner and not as a subordinate one.
Now, Carney himself has acknowledged that India is central to a number of supply chains. How much did Canada's economic interest trump its initial principled stance on this invitation?
Well, you know what? The fact of the matter is, Canada's relationship with India, especially under Justin Trudeau, was not principled. It was all virtue signaling, and it was all politics. The fact of the matter is that India is crucial to Canada, and Canada needs to decide whether ultimately it's going to side with the democracies like India and the United States, or whether it's going to posture the way Justin Trudeau did and allow China, which also has significant interests in Canada, to run amok. Basically, we're getting to the decision point in Ottawa. Are you going to be part of a Western club of industrialized democracies, or are you going to be a Chinese satrapy, no different than, for example, Djibouti?
Right. Now, the Kalistan issue has clearly complicated the India-Canadian relationship. In your assessment, have the more vocal Kalistan groups actually hurt Canada's broader strategic interests?
Absolutely. Look, this isn't just with regard to the Khalistan movement. We see this in every single country. When you tolerate terrorists, any terrorism, when you give safe haven to any terror group, ultimately, your own interests are going to be subverted. Justin Trudeau, and frankly, Pierre Trudeau before him, by embracing and tolerating the Khalistan movement in the face of some of the worst terrorist attacks in the 20th century, what they did is ultimately undermine Canada's moral authority and its strategic importance. Hopefully, Mark Carney, as a professional, understands this and can start to reverse a generation of damage.
So what you're indicating is that the fringe separatist voices shouldn't dictate Canada's relationship with a major democracy like India. Do you see this reset as Canada recalibrating its priorities? Do you see that this Prime Minister, any hope in relationship going forward?
I absolutely do. Look, the fact that Mark Carney is working on repairing the relationship rather than following Justin Trudeau down the rabbit hole already shows that Prime Minister Carney is a much more serious person than the former Prime Minister of Canada. That itself should be enough. Now, India is humble enough and professional enough to allow Canada to have a blank slate and to demonstrate its good faith. But make no mistake, Canada now needs to demonstrate its good faith. India is not a football, which you kick around. India is an ally, which you strive to embrace.
Right. Now, with China's growing influence and the need for democratic partnerships, most countries in the West think so. How important is it for Canada to have India back in the fold?
Look, China has been able to pressure Canada in much the same way that China has pressured Pakistan and Sri Lanka. It is much harder for Beijing to digest a country like Canada, however. Fortunately, Canada realizes that what China's true aims are. And even though Justin Trudeau was being blinded by the trees and not being able to see the forest, so far, Prime Minister Carney recognizes the real threat which China poses to Canada's supply chains and to its political future, to its liberalism and to its freedom to act. By any measure, it makes much more sense for Ottawa to embrace New Delhi and to partner with India than to embrace Beijing and to partner with the People's Republic of China. At the same time, Prime Minister Carney likely recognizes that, according to US intelligence, there could very well be a war in the Pacific by 2027. Canada is a Pacific power. And in this case, Canada needs to decide, should there be a conflict in the Pacific over Taiwan, a conflict which reaches Pacific islands like Guam or even Hawaii, whether Canada is going to stand with the United States or to stand with China. Frankly, all Canadians, as angry as they may be at Donald Trump, are going to stand with the United States. Justin Trudeau was too immature and too amateurish to be able to see a day or even a week ahead of time, let alone a few years. Carney, however, is professional, and it seems that the professionals are back in charge in Ottawa.